Yeah, I forgot that too. And for drought, what's really interesting is what happens later in the summer. So it means we have reduced stream flow in late summer and, oh, thank you. I wasn't sure how to get to that screen. Thank you. So in late summer, we have reduced stream flows. And so this is kind of my linkage into drought and some of the concerns around drought planning and drought adaptation. So you probably already know this, but just to really emphasize this idea that snowpack has historically served as a form of storage. Sometimes they're referred to as the water towers of the West or wherever the snowpack is located. And as Philip Mote and colleagues have described, this is a way of transferring that precipitation from the relatively wet winter to the relatively typically dry summer. And again, just because of the importance of that timing of the stream flow, as this runoff is occurring earlier, and then we get that late summer, lower summer stream flows, we're having events like this 2016 fish kill, which happened on the Yellowstone River outside of Yellowstone National Park. So there were suddenly thousands of dead whitefish floating up to the surface of the river. Certainly caught a lot of headlines. Ultimately, it was a parasite that caused the death of these whitefish, but biologists say that indeed the high temperatures, high water temperatures, and low flows made the fish more vulnerable to this parasite. And it resulted in a lot of, well, they had to close the river to fishing and tourism, so there were some financial impacts to the tourist industry, fishing industry, but also a lot of conflicts, a lot of finger pointing, especially at agricultural diversions for the low flows. But it also sparked some conversation and interest around drought planning and mitigating drought and really trying to ensure that we have this late summer stream flow. You know, how can we ensure that there is water in the stream later in the summer? And so as part of that growing interest, I was invited to participate in this working group on drought. And specifically, the focus was on ecological drought. It was part of a Science for Nature and People partnership project with lots of organizations, lots of different researchers, including a couple of social scientists, myself, and my colleague, McEvoy, so I want to give a shout out to in the back there. She was a lead on a lot of the papers that I'll be discussing. So before joining this project, I didn't realize how many different ways drought is defined and described. So to encourage a little bit of audience participation, I have some cards for anyone who can say some ways about, or the ways in which you think drought is, or you hear drought most commonly talked about.
And the Zoom audience can jump in if you like as well.
And there are several right answers, so it's not just one. But when you hear of drought, what are kind of the typical concerns, or how is it typically described?
Agriculture.
Yes, agricultural drought. So that is the big one, the main one, and it's impact focused, right? So what are the impacts of the drought? So the impacts to agriculture, and that's really, at least in the States, and I think globally, that's one of the main ways we talk about drought, the impacts to agriculture.
Someone on Zoom says when water demand exceeds supply.
Yes, and I love that. Interestingly, that's not super common. I'd love to know if that's I assume an interdisciplinary thinker, maybe a geographer, because often it's described just as hydrological and not necessarily thinking about the human component. But, and I'll get to that, our framework, which certainly includes that human demand component.
Samir, who's written on this, writes meteorological, hydrological, and agricultural.
All right, this is for Samir.
He's not here, someone else.
Oh.
Sorry, Samir.
So that's the other main way. So there's the impacts and the drivers, and primarily it's impacts to human-dominated systems or the systems that humans care about. And the other way it's talked about is in terms of drivers. But those drivers usually focus on hydrological, meteorological, and less, as the other person mentioned, human use. So our group, again, really focused on ecological drought. Of course, we know drought affects ecosystems, and people who manage these systems, live in these systems, use these systems, they know that. Just that in the sort of academic literature, there was not really a definition for ecological drought, and we're even just sort of in early stages of really describing what are the impacts and how would we go about monitoring and measuring for those impacts to then make decisions to mitigate ecological impacts. So the first thing our group did was come up with a definition, which is on the screen here. And I'm sorry, I have to turn around to read it. I don't have it memorized. It's an episodic deficit in water availability that drives ecosystems beyond the thresholds of vulnerability. It also impacts ecosystem services and triggers feedbacks in natural and or human systems. So that's our definition. And it's really centered around this idea of ecologically available water. And then we developed this framework to think about, on the left side, the kind of natural components, and on the right side, the more human components. So drivers, both ecological and human, as well as responses, and then how those responses can also affect the vulnerability. What else did I want to say here? Oh, I wanted to mention that we drew significant inspiration from Anne Van Loon paper on drought in the Anthropocene, and as geographers talk about a lot, it's really hard to talk about something as a natural hazard. We really like to think about the ways that the human role in mitigating and preventing drought. So our next step was to test this framework. And we chose the Upper Missouri headwaters as our case study site for 2 reasons.
So, Jamie, sorry, just to put it in context, given that most people have talked about drought in those other ways, was this the first time ecological drought has been defined, or is this just a variation on the bigger literature that talks about ecological drought in different ways?
We say it's the first time it's been defined, and has been cited as that. If anyone knows of a previous definition out there.
Are there similar ones, Mark, that you're familiar with that are more ecology focused?
I don't know, so like succinctly phrased.
Sorry, I was just curious.
Yeah.
How it fits in terms of the other definitions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we wanted to test this out, and we chose the Upper Missouri for a couple of reasons. We were working with folks who work with drought nationally. In the US, it's the National Drought Mitigation Center. They do national and international work. And they had a hunch that in Montana, people talk about drought differently in sort of a more ecological sense. So we sort of had that going in, that maybe Montana was a bit different. Not to say it's totally unique, but different than some places. And then also because in 2014, under the Obama administration's climate action plan, they have designated 2 areas to be a national drought resiliency partnership pilot project. So, a mouthful there. But this, the idea behind this partnership, so one of these 2 pilot projects was then based in Southwest Montana in the Upper Missouri Headwaters region. And the goal of this partnership was to bring together various resources, and so that includes information, data, tools from various partners at the federal, state, and local level, with the ultimate goal of building drought resiliency, building capacity for drought resiliency at the local watershed level. And this slide of alphabet soup shows the various partners involved. The point here is just to show it's a large group of federal, state, regional, and local partners. And I want to emphasize, so this was an effort that was ongoing outside of our working group. So our working group then just kind of dovetailed with this effort that was already underway to do some research and collaborate and really focus in on this concept of ecological drought in the Upper Missouri Headwaters. So we used this list of groups, this list of partners, as our sampling framework on the social science side to think about who we wanted to interview. So we conducted 44 interviews with representatives from these various organizations. We had a 1-day ecosystem ecosystem services workshop with 18 participants. And then we also collected as many planning documents as we could from these organizations. So any planning document we could find, we have a copy of, and it's over 40 documents that we have that we're still analyzing. I'll talk about that shortly. There were a lot of questions we had, but the two that I'm going to focus on today are how the participants understood drought and what we end up calling the drought orientation of our interviewees, and then also innovative ways for preparing for drought. And I'll talk about that at the end of my talk. So first is this question of drought orientation. So we know that drought can affect both natural and human systems, but when it comes to humans and managers and decision makers, how are they thinking about drought? How are they perceiving drought? What part of drought are they focused on? So my colleague Amanda had this idea, this vision of she called it the Eye of Sauron figure, that would basically help us think about, a type 1 orientation is someone who just sees the drought on the natural system impacts. A type 2 drought perceives impacts to the human system, and then a type 3 is this more integrated perspective that sees impacts to both human and natural systems. And so again, we wanted to know among our interviewees, those people participating in this drought pilot project, what was their perspective on drought? And to answer that question, we analyzed our interviews and specifically responses to these 3 questions about how they defined their role vis-a-vis drought, how they defined drought, so in response to question 2, and then also what outcomes or impacts of drought they specifically manage for. All right, so this is what we found, and there's a lot going on in this figure, so I'll walk you through the 3 parts of our findings. So first, First is clarifying, so the bars, each bar represents a single interview. Most interviews were with 1 person. Occasionally, I think there was 1 interview that had 3 people, so we call it interview, not interviewees. But each bar represents an interview. And then we coded, and we can talk later about social science coding if that phrase seems odd. But we basically looked for how they described their role, and if they described their role as just focusing on ecosystems, it's yellow, people, blue, or if they describe their role as both people and ecosystems, they're green. So you can see the majority of our interviewees describe their role in an integrated fashion, dealing with or seeing their role as related to drought for both, affecting both humans and nature. The next step was to look at how they define drought, specifically when asked the question, how do you define drought? So we looked at if they were defining it by drivers or impacts, or both drivers and impacts. And then for those, I think there was only 3 who said drivers only. I think it was 11 who said impacts only, and 30 said both impacts and drivers. So for those 41 people who said either impacts or impacts and drivers, we then looked at what type of impacts they mentioned in their definition. So did they mention impacts just to people or impacts just to ecosystems or both? And we saw that more than half our interviewees defined drought in a more integrated way, mentioning both drought affecting people and ecosystems. And the third step then was to look at how they talked about drought overall. In part, in response to that question, what do you manage for? What are your biggest concerns in your management related to drought? But also just throughout the interview as a whole. So across the 44 interviews, we had 100 different types of drought impacts mentioned. And so then we coded those for either being natural, ecological impacts or not ecological impacts. And then we took a percentage, and so the people on the left, the percentage of the bar that's shaded shows the percentage of impacts they mentioned that we coded as ecological. So on the left-hand side are the people who mentioned mostly throughout the entire interview, more natural impacts. On the right side are the people who mentioned more human impacts. And in the middle is this type 3 kind of integrated natural human. And what we thought was interesting is that despite people's role, which they described as fairly integrated, and despite their definition being fairly integrated, when it comes down to the impacts they manage, there is more kind of siloed management. And we think, that makes sense when it comes down to your day-to-day activities. Even if you have a broad understanding of drought, you ultimately have to manage, a smaller realm of that. But we thought it was interesting, sort of those differences. We then compared the drought orientation to their job type. So we had watershed level employees, folks who work for watershed councils or local organizations, state employees, federal employees, and nonprofit NGO employees. And for those at the watershed level, almost all of them, 8 out of 9, were much more human focused, focused more on the human impacts. The state level employees, a bit more mixed, and the federal employees were mostly focused on ecological impacts. I think it's like 14 out of 20 of those interviewees, more ecological focused. And then among our NGOs, it's split between ecologically focused and integrated, and only one NGO interviewee mentioned had a human focused drought orientation. All right, so the kind of so what about all of this? So we think it's interesting that and important to understand the different ways in which different stakeholders perceive drought, the way they perceive the problem, and then really trying to align those different perceptions with management. As I mentioned, we think that the more narrow focus on their mention of what they actually manage day to day reflects the institutional constraints of what they have to do for their job. So we saw value in something like the National Drought Resiliency Partnership as an overarching effort that could help bridge different agencies and different mandates and bring together different perspectives. So people who have different perspectives and different goals on drought, and an effort like the National Drought Resiliency Partnership can help kind of bridge across those. Okay, so a different way we went about trying to understand how people understand drought in Upper Missouri headwaters was through analyzing these drought plans. So we looked at the 5 drought plans listed here, and if anyone knows this region well, you might pick up that the Blackfoot is outside of the Upper Missouri headwaters, but that plan is held up by state officials as a really excellent example of drought planning. So we wanted to look at what's in there and then compare these other plans dating back to an older 1988 plan to avoid dewatering up to more recent 2016 plans. And what we did is we looked at these plans. If they mentioned an ecological impact, if it was just mentioned, we gave it a 1. If it was mentioned and described in some amount of detail, we gave it a 2. And if it was mentioned, described, and associated with an indicator, we gave it a 3. And our colleagues at the Drought Mitigation Center really emphasized the importance of indicators for having actionable plans to deal with drought. And so our finding really was that in these plans, the only item that scored a 3 were impacts to fish and fisheries. So while forest fires and impacts to forests were mentioned and perhaps described, as well as impacts to grassland productivity and fish and wildlife, wildlife, not fish, just wildlife, were maybe mentioned and described, they were never associated with an indicator. And so one of the interviewees really kind of sums up our finding about ecological drought. When people say health of the river, or even broadly health of the ecosystem, what they really mean is health of the fisheries in the river. It's a really narrow view of ecological drought. And when we looked at the indicators used for fish and fisheries, it was primarily based on stream flow and water temperature. And through our interviews, we heard managers talking about other indicators that they either do use or could be used And these include soil moisture, NDVI, and the ED drought index. So there is room for more indicators to be used that could then maybe point to and help monitor for impacts outside of just impacts to fish and fisheries. And as I was mentioning, we've collected over 40 different plans from different agencies, from Forest Service plans to Bureau of Land Management plans to water quality and watershed plans. And we're still analyzing those, and I'll be talking a bit more in Layla's class when we talk about polycentric governance and just the way there's this overlapping map of really complicated jurisdictions, that there's a lot of room out there to think about ecological impacts and monitor for ecologically available water. And perhaps one way to get there is through better communication between the managers behind these plans. All right, so moving into the second part, which is focused on ways for preparing for drought. And I'm gonna just focus on two today, shared sacrifice and then natural water storage and beaver mimicry. So just briefly, this concept of shared sacrifice relies on voluntary reductions in irrigation diversions. And this was the primary method used in the drought plans that we looked at. They all pretty much all relied on this concept of shared sacrifice. And this is really an extra legal workaround the prior appropriation legal doctrine. So I think it's similar in Canada. In the US, it's first in time, first in right, and then use it or lose it. And this is the part that people who have a water right, if they're not using it, they are potentially at risk. Granted, it's over a period of like 8 years, but if you're not using the water, you're at risk of losing it. And really that was established to keep people from hoarding water and just keeping it. The idea was if you want to establish a water right, you need to be using it. But now it has this sort of perverse incentive of people being afraid that if they don't use it, they'll lose it. And so to actually engage in shared sacrifice, you technically are breaking the law. And it's kind of interesting because our state water rights agency does promote this, and they say 1 year you're not going to lose your right. It has to be over a period of time, and it has to show intent of abandonment. But basically the idea is that in basins that have a history of low flows, there's a desire to keep some water in the stream. And in part it's because maybe people are neighbors and family members that rely on different aspects of the river for income. So not just irrigating, but also angling, fish guiding, and things like that. But there is a slightly bigger hammer hanging over the head of some people in some basins, and that is the Endangered Species Act. So if there are low flows and a species become endangered, there's suddenly a lot more policies and management that gets put on individual landowners. So there's an incentive to keep species from becoming listed. And in fact, there's a program called the Candidate Conservation Agreement with Assurances. And this is actually a more formal plan. So some of this shared sacrifice is happening very informally, but there are other places where it's much more formal, and it's where there are endangered species at risk. And so these candidate conservation agreements with assurances are put into place with a landowner or an irrigator and various state agencies that come up with a plan to say, look, if the irrigator takes the steps outlined in this plan and does what they can to keep the species from becoming listed, if despite those efforts the species still becomes listed, the landowner or irrigator is not on the hook for doing any additional changes to their management. So at least they sort of know what they're looking at if they agree to one of these plans. And the benefit of either the voluntary shared sacrifice or these conservation agreements are keeping the ecological benefit is maintaining minimum flows for fisheries, and the human benefits are avoiding conflicts between irrigators and recreationalists, and also avoiding the endangered species listing. But as I mentioned earlier, this focus on just fisheries and kind of minimum flows for fisheries is still a limited view of ecological impacts of drought. Okay, so for the last 5-10 minutes here, I'm going to talk about natural water storage as another form of drought mitigation, or a strategy that a lot of people mentioned in our interviews as a way to mitigate drought. And I've been living in this world for the last 5 years where it seems like everybody's talking about beaver mimicry, but when I step outside of my own little researcher world, I realize not everyone is talking about beaver mimicry. So if you're not familiar with it, the idea is that you can build structures to mimic the function that a beaver dam provides. And it is basically for an inside stream, a stream that has been cut down, you can help to build and raise the bed of the stream and reconnect the stream with the floodplain. Let's see, what else did I want to say? Oh, so in Montana, there's a real interest in beaver mimicry. It's mentioned in our state water plan. And because of that earlier graph that I showed you with that change in peak stream flow, there's a recognition that we need more storage. So the question is, what form is that storage going to take? Are we going to have more large concrete dams, high elevation reservoirs, or are there alternative ways to provide more storage through things like beaver mimicry, these natural water storage projects? But there's a growing rift between restoration practitioners, some people endearingly refer to them as the beaver believers, and scientists. So the beaver believers, the practitioners, they report a myriad range of environmental benefits, primarily groundwater storage, increasing groundwater levels, increasing late summer stream flows, but also things like bank stability and water quality and better fish habitat. But scientists argue that there's still a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of complexity, and it's understudied. And if you're interested in this, I would definitely point you to a recent article led by Carolyn Nash. It came out recently in Biosciences, and she talks about the process pathways, so the various things that have to happen in order to get the outcomes that are promised. And as someone who's been listening to these conversations, I've heard about these disagreements, but also heard about uncertainties around social, kind of the regulatory or legal situation for beaver mimicry. So as part of a separate study, but with my colleague Amanda Craven still, we combined 2 sets of interview data for a total of 49 interviews. So this is a different interview project. And one set of interviews focused on scientists and practitioners. And then I had a graduate student who had interviewed landowners in Southwest Montana. And so combining those, we were able to look at perspectives of scientists, practitioners, and landowners on beaver mimicry. And we used a framework by David Cash focused on salience, credibility, and legitimacy to understand how these different actors understand and evaluate the evidence for beaver mimicry. So salience is, how is this information relevant to the decision context? Credibility is this information produced by sources that are perceived to be authoritative? And then legitimacy is the process by which the information produced perceived as being fair and unbiased. And I won't walk you through, first, looking at our interviews, we found that there were 3 areas of contested science or unsettled science. And one is around those ecological outcomes. Also the regulatory uncertainty, and then also disagreement about how cheap or less costly this project is and the ease of implementing these projects. There were different views about that. So I won't go through the details of each of these. We just found out our paper has been accepted, so all of those details are in the paper. But I want to focus on just kind of the key findings from each group. So for scientists, it won't surprise you that for them, credibility meant meeting the standards of the scientific process. So things going through experiment and then being published through the peer review process. So for them, for information to be credible, it really needed to be this type of peer-reviewed science. And we had one scientist say, I'm not trying to be a condescending white tower academic, but the concern among scientists was really that if we don't do this research, that we might end up causing more problems than benefits. When we contrasted that or compared that with the way practitioners talk about the credibility of the information, they draw on a much wider spectrum of data, and they were much more comfortable with a range of information. It could be scientific information, but they were also comfortable with experience and experiential data and information. They use the term anecdotal to describe information that they had learned through their experience or through word of mouth, and they counted that as credible. So as a quote, one stream restoration practitioner said, "We can anecdotally see this making the landscape better. Therefore, why do we need to do this monitoring and answer these questions?" It was more of a, let's get these projects on the ground. They're working. We don't have money to monitor them, so let's just do it. And then when it came to landowners were much less concerned about the scientific basis or any kind of scientific debate over this. Only 2 landowners mentioned any kind of concern about the scientific basis of these projects. For them, it was much more important that the information came from a trusted source that was like a neighbor or someone working for a local agency. And then the salience of the information was important. And for them, information was salient if it helped them to understand the cost benefit of a project at the property, at their own personal kind of property level. So as a landowner said, first for a rancher, he's got to see that it will not be detrimental. Second, he's got to see that it has some kind of economic benefit. So for them, the information that would help them decide this was the most important information and the most salient information. So what of this research? We see beaver mimicry as like other contested conservation techniques. It represents not just a case of scientific and regulatory uncertainty, but a meeting point where different communities who hold different values come together and have to negotiate what makes information credible, salient, or legitimate. And we see those negotiations as deeper negotiations of different ways of knowing. And I think one of the takeaways for us is, while it may not be possible or productive to try and convince someone of your epistemological approach, we think that just recognizing that those different epistemological approaches out there, understanding them and sharing those with the different groups, hopefully can help lead to better understanding of environmental conflicts and perhaps new ways of approaching and dealing with these conflicts. So last slide here is just for those of you, I don't know how many are geographers, but I believe most of you are interdisciplinary in IRES. And so for me, really thinking about what is it that as a geographer I bring to the table, and that I think you all, given your training, bring to the table, is this integrated or interdisciplinary perspective of drought. So first, understanding drivers of drought in an integrated fashion, understanding impacts of drought in an integrated fashion, and then analyses that are attuned to different priorities, different values, and different ways of knowing among diverse stakeholders. So with that, I'll leave this list as well as my email up here, and I'm happy to answer questions now, and also happy, I'm on sabbatical, which means I have time. So if anyone ever wants to grab coffee or lunch, feel free to contact me, and I'd love to also hear about your research.
So we'll go to questions, so you can mention in the chat if you have a question or raise your hand, and then I'll monitor that, and otherwise we'll go to in the room. That's all. Thanks, Jenny.
And if you don't mind, maybe just say your name and then maybe briefly your general area of study.
Sure. My name is Carissa Rinaldi. I'm a PhD candidate at the Land Food Systems, Integrated Studies in Land and Food Systems program. And I'm studying knowledge controversies in water, oil nexus. And I was fascinated by this research on the beaver mimicry approach and this kind of concept of comparing how different stakeholders view credibility, salience, and
Legitimacy.
Legitimacy.
I have to.
I've been thinking similarly about just how different stakeholders might approach uncertainty in knowledge controversies and how they view the role of the expert related to the framework. And I'm just wondering, when, I don't know if you've gotten to this point where you are talking to the stakeholders and presenting them with the different perspectives that you've found, but do people feel like it's enough to know that, that there are differences in approaches to these concepts, or they feel the need to create a system of knowledge generation and knowledge application that everyone can agree to, that meets the needs of science as well as citizens and policymakers?
Yeah, thanks. That's a great question. And just I'll try and briefly summarize it. So applying it to your work in the oil and gas perceptions of risk and uncertainty and views about, expert and credibility of expert. And how, have I presented these results and how do the different groups perceive it? So we had a small amount of funding from a nonprofit who's really interested. So that's the Nature Conservancy, and the Nature Conservancy is a big promoter of the natural water storage beaver mimicry. And I think some of the things that were most surprising to them, I didn't get into it here, but the different views about cost and ease, both practitioners, which include the nonprofit folks as well as stream practitioners, and scientists, always describe these as low cost and really easy. And then when you talk to the landowners, it's like, well, it's not low cost. I have to maybe give up some land. I have to maintain it. Someone has to be looking out for it. If it floods, I'm going to have to deal with all these impacts. So it's not exactly low cost, and it's not that easy. Whereas the practitioners and scientists were thinking of it like in relative terms of other types of stream restoration techniques. So I think that was pretty eye-opening for the NGO. Just realizing that our view of ease is not the same. I have talked a bit about this, in academic circles, and I think there's always this question of, because especially, I don't want to lump all physical scientists together, but typically there's the epistemological view is a little more positivist, and the idea that if we just show people the information that we have from science, if we just tell them enough times, surely they'll understand. And I think what social science and what this is suggesting is that no, that's not enough. And I wouldn't say I really had these conversations, but I think it's certainly an interesting direction to head is, can we have conversations about what does create credible information? And would scientists be willing to maybe give a little that, okay, it doesn't have to be published in a peer-reviewed journal, but we still want to see some amount of evidence, or at least have more monitoring going on so that we can move towards this greater understanding of the outcomes. I don't know hopefully that answers your question. And I might also suggest, if you haven't already looked at Mary Douglas's cultural theory of risk, that could be really interesting for you around oil and gas. If you email me, I have a couple things I could send you. But I think Mary Douglas has some really interesting work on trust in experts and risk.
We have a question from Maddie, who I think is incidentally in Bozeman.
Oh.
Is that right? even though she's one of ours, she's not one of yours.
All
Go
right.
ahead, Betty. You're on mute still, I think, for some, oh.
I think I'm off now. Let me know if you can hear me.
Yeah.
Am I good? Yeah. Hi, Jamie. Thank you so much for your talk. And yeah, it's funny. I'm calling in from Bozeman. I grew up here, actually in Spring Hill, so this is very much home for me. So it's very fun to hear about work happening in this, I think, really fascinating topic in a place that I call home. And my work is mostly in conservation governance, primarily in mountain areas. I look at community forests mostly at the moment. And I'm really interested, since I moved back here about a year ago, and I've been hearing a lot all summer about the drought, and specifically hearing from small farmers about how land use changes are impacting their sensitivity to drought and their adaptive capacity, particularly pastoralists. So people, especially people who don't have their own land, but who are reliant on either Forest Service land or other private land nearby. And I'm curious if your interviewees in the first study you talked about had the kind of regulators or members of these different organizations had thoughts on the relative impact of meteorological drought versus land use changes on local capacity to adapt, and what insights they might have brought forward on that.
Yeah, no, that's a great question and really fun. I hope, yeah, well, you're from there, so you know the area well. Yeah, I was actually, I think that was kind of one of the surprising things from our interviews, was this sort of more integrated understanding of the drivers. And again, I'd love to know outside of the Montana context, or maybe I am misreading the broader understanding of how most people think about drought, but from the literature, it really suggests that it's really this idea of lack of rain and meteorological drought, or for some reason the hydrological drought. But less focus on human uses. And there really was in our interviews a surprising amount of people really acknowledging that human land use, human water use drives drought. And I was really surprised, and it was quite prevalent. So I think more than half of our interviewees mentioned that. And I need to go back to kind of draw out, so at what scale was it more the federal folks or the local watershed folks? And did it matter whether they were Forest Service or BLM? But my recollection is that it was across a pretty broad spectrum of this recognition of human drivers. And I think that's really exciting from the social sciences side, that there's a huge role for a better understanding of human water use, and hopefully moving a little bit beyond these really quantitative, like just using dam levels or irrigation withdrawal levels, that there's a lot more nuance going on with whether it's land use change or how that water actually gets used, and really cool in areas for hydrologists and social scientists to come together to get this better understanding. So I hope that answers your question a bit.
Yeah, thank you so much. There's a lot of questions I have for you. I'll hopefully follow up in an email.
Yeah, please do.
Thank you.
Yeah, hi, my name is Carl. I'm in environmental engineering, with a PhD there, and I deal with everything related to from biological drinking water filters and gene sequencing and understanding that. And I'm also trying to get into the kind of building partnerships to solve drinking water problems area, partnerships between different types of people, the water end users or the engineers or the policy and government. So along that kind of line, my question is, you've identified using these three different areas of different types of stakeholders, put more emphasis on the credibility or the salience or the legitimacy, right. So if you wanted to get all these different types of people together to address drought, or to get them together and say, let's make an action plan for building fake beaver dams, what kind of tools could you use to get people who see the same problem from different perspectives? What kind of tools would you be able to use to get them talking the same language and come to a consensus as a team together, instead of just different stakeholders contributing ideas, but working as a team?
Yeah, really interesting. So quickly, the question was, how might you get the scientists, practitioners, landowners to think about and come to consensus on? So a bit like your question too, like, and maybe this is a really great research project, because I don't think we're there yet. I think that would be a fascinating next step. And actually, I just was on a phone call with a colleague, Molly Cross, who is the Director of Climate Change Adaptation for the Americas section of Wildlife Conservation Society. And she had kind of spurred this working group and is really interested in beaver mimicry, in part because her agency has funded a lot of beaver mimicry, and then they're sort of saying, oh, do we want to mainstream this and sort of say this is a climate change adaptation strategy, run with it, or is there too much scientific uncertainty where they need to sort of say, before we sort of, what her organization calls mainstream it, should we keep doing, do we need to do more monitoring? And so we sort of brought these findings to her, and we sort of said, yeah, I mean, where we sort of left off from our findings was that it would be interesting to bring those people together. So I'm hopeful that she has a bit of funding, and she had promised to do some work in this area, so she needs to do something. And so I think she was pretty struck by this idea of maybe bringing those groups together and seeing how they might come. So I don't have an answer, but I think it's a really interesting question. And I think that would be great, a room where you bring folks together. I don't know if anyone else has suggestions or ideas along those lines, but I think it's kind of the next step.
Hi, my name is Rapichen, but I go by Pat. I'm a PhD student at IRES. And my work is on like river conservation, but more like reconceptualizing the idea of flows, environmental flows, and bringing in like decolonial, feminist, STS into understanding that, and using ethnographic work to drive that reconceptualization further. And my question is about like, you mentioned different epistemologies given like the different groups of people involved in this process, and I'm curious in terms of getting the sort of like indigenous or like, because given the setting, I'm sure there are different groups of people, and sort of how that inform like this new or other ways of thinking and relating to nature and water.
Yeah.
And also I'm curious about, like, you mentioned these drought adaptation plans, and one of them is about like Blackfoot.
Mm-hmm.
And so like, what might be some, insights from the contrast that perhaps you found?
Yeah, great, really great questions. And all of your research, I'd love to hear more about, but especially around in-stream flows, because that's sort of something that we've come to is this idea of minimum in-stream flows. I mean, in many ways, that's bare minimum, and there are lots of other ways of thinking about how much water is needed and what are the trade-offs. So I'd really love to hear and see where you're headed with your research. So one clarification, so the Blackfoot plan here, so there is the Blackfeet Nation north of Bozeman. And then the area where we were working, southwest Montana, it is traditional territory of the Blackfeet peoples for hunting and fishing grounds, but it's not currently part of the Blackfeet Nation. And so the management, so when that Blackfoot plan, when I actually mentioned that's outside of, it's like just outside, just west of the upper Missouri headwaters, and it's separate from, so it's a bit confusing because there's the Blackfoot River, and that's the Blackfoot plan for the Blackfoot River, which is separate from the Blackfeet Nation. And so it's the demographics are such that it's predominantly white landowners and irrigators, and same with much of the region we're in. While it's traditional historic hunting territory and communal grounds for several tribes, there's not any, I don't want to say no active management, because there are actually some really interesting water rights questions related to the historic fishing rights. So actually, current state water rights are affected by tribal historic fishing rights, if that is making sense. But for these plans, it's primarily developed by the landowners, which are predominantly white irrigators. That said, in the Blackfeet Nation, separate from our study, there are a couple of NGOs who've been working, and there is a lot of interest in the Blackfeet Nation among, especially people in their climate change adaptation program, of thinking about beaver. their origin story is related to beaver, and so there's a lot of interesting ways of thinking and knowing through beaver themselves, and then just different ways of even just sort of their water rights systems. There are more opportunities and options than in the state system. So there are a lot of ongoing beaver mimicry projects, and if anyone's interested, you can email me and I'll I'll forward the link through the National Adaptation Forum coming up in the next several weeks. There are a couple of webinars on tribal climate adaptation, and I believe there will be presentations from folks in the Blackfeet Nation doing these beaver mimicry projects. Again, I'm not involved and it didn't come up because it's not actually happening in the Upper Missouri headwaters. But yeah, I think those are great questions to think about.
Go. I'll go after. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm Anna. I am a PhD student in IRES, and I'm working on kind of the social dimensions of rewilding, and I'm interested in national climate solutions. And I've also been a beaver dork in my past and current life. I live in Washington, and there's a lot of active translocation of active beavers happening. And for all the reasons that you stated that the beaver mimicry things are effective, I'm just curious, in Montana, like, are beaver translocations part of the plan? And also, are there plans to build like beaver dam analogs or do translocations onto public lands instead of just private lands?
Yeah, great question. So mentioning that in Washington, there's a big relocation effort for actual beaver, and that's super interesting. Yeah, I've seen the videos from like the 70s. They would parachute out these beavers. I don't know if it was in Washington in particular, but there's been interest in beaver for a long time. And they are super fascinating. And yeah, they would like parachute these beaver out, and then they could chew through the like wooden box that they were in and then resettle. So now they're doing it differently. And in the McEvoy Valley, I believe is an area that's really doing a lot of beaver reintroduction. I would say in Montana, so two things. First, a lot of the habitat has been destroyed. And so first, the idea is that if you just reintroduce beaver, they wouldn't establish because there's no woody vegetation. And so for some people, the beaver dam analogs or the mimicry is to improve the vegetation so that beaver could be reintroduced. But for other people, it's like, oh, we don't want beavers. That was an interesting conversation among some of the landowners. Some said, yeah, I've had beavers, they can be really helpful. Others said, no, they're a pest. And if this beaver mimicry leads to beaver coming onto my property, I don't want it. And if it means that there's like this secret agenda of people actually wanting beaver and they're not telling me, and that's the ultimate goal, I really want to know that, and I also don't want it. So yeah, some really interesting relationships between landowners and beaver. And I would say more so on public land, from what I've read, I think. In Montana, almost all of the studies I'm aware of are these mimicry. There could well be efforts to actually reintroduce beaver, but it's a fraught topic, for sure.
I was just gonna ask, I guess I have 2 or 3 different questions, so I'll hold the others till we go for drinks. So anyone's welcome to come for drinks. We're just gonna try and find the spot up at the upper floors, right? To go
The
grab
gallery, maybe?
gallery
Does that sound right?
and have a drink, which in the COVID times we haven't done a lot of, so we'll go over there for anyone who can make it. So I'll save 1 or 2 for there, but just can we talk a little bit more about the sort of broader ecological focus that informs the work? So I'm thinking both of the definition of ecological drought and your sort of statements about the fact that most people only focus on fisheries. So what would it look like to have a broader ecological orientation and how we think about or respond to or work to mitigate droughts? So what other things would come into view or would be part of our toolkit perhaps? So crossing over to some of where Mark's interest maybe if you think more about the vegetation or other species or other things that might be at play. And actually, something you just said also was forcing me to think along these lines, because you said there's not really a forest to think of to allow beaver or forested areas or whatever you said. in which case, the whole questions around buffers and other things that are really important for water quality and other issues that we know about, like you're not there. So do we have to think about a much broader context about, let's call it ecological health or well-being, to be able to think about drought resilience? Or how, if just focusing on something quite narrow, like the fish or beaver mimicry, is still not taking into account a broader sensibility about what would be a healthy landscape. And it ties a little bit to Maddie's questions about land use as well. So do you see, in terms of focusing on ecological drought and asking people about how they think about drought, did you see some ways in to allow for rethinking about a broader ecological context of drought and how we can think in a more integrated fashion instead of just the river or the water quality or the water quantity or something quite narrow?
Yeah. And that's where I'm excited for this long in-process plan analysis. So analyzing 40 different plans, from forest plans to Bureau of Land, which is like rangeland. And it does seem like there's a lot of opportunity there. And so, yeah, for our research, I'm excited to see how we can demonstrate how these different plans can speak to each other and like what's happening in the forest, whether it's looking at forest thinning projects, which is also controversial, but there's this idea that because there's so much, I'm going to use the wrong ecological terms here, but so much, forest built up that the snowpack isn't reaching the forest floor, and then it's not reaching the groundwater. And so if there's some amount of thinning, what's kind of would be the ideal amount of forest cover to also allow that infiltration. So I've seen some talks from forest ecologists talking about that. And then I would also point to Carolyn Nash's, this idea of process pathways, and I think that's what she's really getting at, is we need more of a causal understanding of what's happening with these beaver mimicry projects, and when can we be more certain that the groundwater will increase, when can we be more certain fish passage can occur, or water quality will be right for certain species, and it's exactly about understanding these kind of broader ecological, the way that the system functions. But a lot of beaver mimicry projects are also about vegetation restoration. So there is the idea that you're bringing back vegetation and doing more bank stabilization. And so there's a lot of talk about it, but not a lot of understanding of the causal mechanisms. And then one other place my head goes related to this question is just, as strange as it might sound, because of course we know drought affects these ecosystems, but we just submitted a grant where we were looking, we don't know if we're funded yet, but we had to get some partners on board so that if funded, so we reached out to the Forest Service, the branch in Montana, and they're very interested. They've been interested. They were involved in our earlier work, very interested in ecological impacts of drought. And basically one forester said, the only region in the Forest Service that's doing any kind of drought planning is the Southwest kind of Arizona region, because it's so prevalent there, but then in Montana, they, as strange as it sounds, just aren't doing drought planning. It's just not part of, they're so busy doing so many other priorities and things that they're doing, but they just don't really have a drought planning process. And he would really like to see a set of indicators and thresholds where management decisions start to take place, and that just doesn't exist. So I think just working in these different agencies that manage different systems, so beyond, that gets us beyond the fisheries focus into forests and rangelands. And yeah,
maybe just following up on that and going back to when you crafted this definition of the ecological drought, because then it didn't explicitly indicate if it's looking at the landscape, if it's looking at the aquatic system, perhaps that was intentional, nor is it sort of holistically thinking about the watershed. And so then, but I do, and so I'm curious your thoughts on that, but then this kind of, these, crossing over into a more vulnerable state was clearly included. And so on the landscape side, clearly the extreme of an ecological drought from kind of soil moisture, landscape level, water availability is going to be this kind of, enhanced fire risk. And so that's, I don't know if they're thinking about that as sort of, or could be.
You mean in terms of fires and stuff, or what else?
Yeah, so I would think, an extreme ecological drought would, be characterized by enhanced fire vulnerability, fire risk, right? And then they go out with the tankers and start dipping into lakes and,
Yeah, so certainly, increased fires, as forest fires in particular, but even grassland fires came up as impacts. But the challenge is, again, there's just not a lot of, because so much of our drought planning and drought focus has been around agricultural drought and the ways in which we monitor and measure for that, there just isn't a consensus about how we would, what tools would we use. And this is getting outside of my area of expertise for sure, but with this grant we just submitted, it's partnering with a remote sensing expert who does a lot of drought forecasting and looking at flash droughts. So like new types of downscale data related to, especially about ET, evapotranspiration kinds of data, and exactly being able to see at earlier stages, at a more fine scale, when can we start to see the vegetation drying out and start to make decisions to, prevent drought or help mitigate the drought or start taking some actions. So that's part of your question. And then the other part about the definition, so we had two ecologists, well, we had several people, but there were two ecologist postdocs who really worked on developing the definition. And I know this concept of ecologically available water was really important to them. I don't actually know if that exists also in literature, but that's what we really built the definition around. And my understanding is that it could be ecologically available, depending on the system you're in, and I think that's pretty intentional. So you could be looking at aquatic systems, or you could be looking at terrestrial systems, and what within those systems, what would be the ecologically available water and the ecological water needs in the systems. Does that help?
Yeah. It wouldn't, because it's a kind of tricky concept, because there's some ecosystems which are, naturally, seasonal. So it's sort of parameters under which they normally operate, and then, when you see excursions from that is when the attention is drawn, perhaps.
Yeah.
So you're saying in terms of the focus on the vulnerability, it helps bring that to light if the species are adapted for seasonal variation, and it would be vulnerable.
Right, yeah. So when you cross over that threshold of enhanced exposure, increased vulnerability.
Yeah. So we have a question from Kushank. Go ahead.
Hi there. My name is Kushank, and I work on food systems and climate change risk. But in my previous life, or a couple of years ago, I used to also work on droughts in India. And I was a part of a project which looked at drought mitigation, drought declaration, and the role of land use in modifying droughts in a semi-arid region. More specifically, how sugarcane production was modifying soil moisture or agriculture droughts. So my question is regarding the drivers versus declaration of ecological drought. So it kind of touches upon what Leila asked as well, is like, if there are multiple indicators involved, which one do you consider first to declare an ecological drought, or would you use like all the indicators together? I faced this issue when I was reviewing the India's national drought declaration policy as well, which even though uses multiple sub-indicators for declaring drought, there was a sequence that they were following, which is also pretty much similar to the idea of drought propagation, that first precipitation drought happens, and then second, there'll be soil moisture drought with, of course, a delay in time, and then there will be a hydrological drought. And connecting back to Van Loo's idea of anthropogenic droughts, if land use affects soil moisture drought, do you still need to have a precipitation drought to declare agriculture drought? So it's just the idea of what kind of sequence, sorry if I'm complicating this too much.
No, that's great.
What kind of sequence would you use when you're considering multiple indicators?
Yeah, no, great question. And I think your question is just getting at how complex this drought world is And I think this is what really fascinates people who really start to get into drought, is realizing like, oh wow, this is really a social construct. I mean, we're determining what is a drought. And I can't speak to the context in India. I'd love to read your work there, and also knowing a bit of Samir Shah's work. He's brought an idea to my attention about an interesting paper could be on like what happens when different types of drought definitions are mobilized. So maybe there's a nugget there that we can work on. That's Samir's idea. But in the US context, and I should know this better than I do, but ultimately the National Drought Monitor is seen as the sort of end decision point. Or they're the kind of final say in when drought gets declared. And that drought declaration then releases certain funding, federal funding, to support mainly agriculturalists, mainly farmers, to mitigate the costs that they're gonna face when they lose crops or lose cattle. I should know what the National Drought Mitigation Center is based off of. And the acronym just isn't coming to me. It's like SPI or
Drought Severity Index.
yes, Palmer Drought Severity Index, which I should also know what that actually is based off of, and I can't off the top of my head. Do you happen to know?
I have to look it up. I think do you have it at your fingertips?
Palmer Drought Severity Index.
It's evapotranspiration, I think.
Okay, mainly in ET.
Yeah.
Mainly, okay, that all sounds right.
Potential, right? Potential ET.
Yeah, potentially ET. So, but what's so interesting to me, and I just got added to this listserv, is for the state of Montana. So you have different stakeholder groups, and they're emailing each other each week saying, this is what I'm seeing here in northern Montana, and I'm in agriculture. Well, I'm a fish wildlife manager here in southwest Montana, and here's what I'm seeing. And so they basically email frantically all week long, and then say, we really need to encourage the National Drought Center to extend, the D3 declaration of drought further south or further north, and then they submit their request, and then the National Drought Mitigation Center, whoever is working it that week, it kind of rotates around, and that person decides, yeah, we agree with you, or no, we don't actually agree with you, and we're not changing that drought declaration. And it has then real consequences for what funding is released or not. So I don't have a strong, I don't know enough at this point to really say, but even folks at the National Drought Mitigation Center, I understand, are wary of that being kind of the sole go-to source, and they would love to see more indicators that people feel are really robust and that they can go to, but at the moment, it is sort of the default determination of drought in the US. But I think part of this, so this new call I was mentioning, we just submitted a grant. It's the first time that NOAA and NIDIS has specifically had a call around ecological drought with an emphasis on new ways of measuring and monitoring. So just this idea that there's more out there, we just don't know enough at this point. And then can managers use it? Is it a usable tool to help people make decisions? Hopefully that helps some. But I'd love to see your work. If you think of it, send me an email with a link if you have anything published. I'd be really interested to see what you've done.
Absolutely, I'll send you an email. Thanks, Jamie.
Yeah, thank you.
We have one last question before we. I'm feeling like Enoch's eyes wants to ask a question. All right, thank you so much, Jamie.
Yeah, thank you all for your time. Yeah.
And Kashank and others, again, as Jamie said, she's around just until December something. So if you're around on campus and available to meet up, it would be nice to have more chats and conversations. And as I said, we'll be heading over for drinks, and whoever can join us, please do. And thanks again.
Thank you.
Bye to everyone online. Take care.